I stood there, frozen in place, my hand gripping the crumpled letter as the conversation from the kitchen reached my ears. "She won't last another year," Brian's voice echoed, thick with a cold certainty. "If we're lucky, maybe 6 months." Rachel's laugh followed, sharp and dismissive. My own son and daughter-in-law, betting on my decline, like my life was theirs to control. After all these years, this was how they saw me, just a wager. But that was the moment I decided, before they could finish their game, I was cashing out. And when I did, they lost everything. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Marilyn woke to the faint hum of the heating pad beneath her, the dull ache in her body, a familiar sensation she could no longer ignore. The early morning light was muted, filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. The house was still, the silence broken only by the soft, rhythmic sound of the pad's warmth against her skin. She shifted slightly, her joints protesting the movement. Her fingers brushed against the cool sheets as she reached for her gray sweatshirt, pulling it over her head with slow precision. The house should have been quiet, but through the half-open door of the bedroom, she heard voices, laughter. Brian and Rachel. Their voices echoed softly from the kitchen, almost playful in their familiarity. Marilyn paused, listening, trying to place the sound of their laughter, something between a joke and a comfort. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone felt wrong. Curiosity gnawed at her. She knew she should just ignore it, roll back over, and let the warmth of the heating pad lull her back to sleep. But something pulled her toward the noise. Something inside her wouldn't let her rest just yet. She got up, her feet light on the floor, each step a quiet shuffle. The hallway stretched out in front of her, its familiar length now feeling like a chasm she had to cross. She moved cautiously, as though she were walking through a dream, her mind still half dazed from sleep. The voices were clearer now, coming from the kitchen just beyond the stairwell. Marilyn stopped in her tracks as Brian's voice cut through the stillness, unexpectedly sharp. "She's fading. I'd bet 6 months." The words hit her like an unexpected slap. Her pulse quickened, and she froze. Fading, 6 months. The weight of the statement settled heavily on her chest. Rachel's voice followed, her tone dismissive but tinged with something darker. "You're generous. 3 if the meds slip." Marilyn's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself into the shadows of the stairwell, her heart hammering in her ears as she tried to process what she had just heard. They were talking about her life like it was a wager. She gripped the railing, the wood cold against her fingers, as the words spiraled in her mind. Fading. 6 months. 3 if the meds slip. A bet. She wanted to scream, to confront them right there in the hallway, but all she could do was stand frozen, a silent witness to the conversation that had not been meant for her ears. The weight of it crushed her, more than the pain that had become a constant companion, more than the slow, steady ache in her body. Her mind raced. She had known something was wrong for a while. The tests, the appointments, the whispered conversations between Brian and Rachel when they thought she couldn't hear. But this was different. This was a clear, undeniable answer. The end was near, and they had already made their bets. She felt the sting of betrayal, the rawness of it tearing through her like a wound that wouldn't heal. Marilyn took a step back, retreating into the darkness of the hallway, away from the kitchen, away from the voices that continued to echo in her mind. She couldn't let them see her, not yet, not now. Back in her room, she closed the door behind her with a soft click. The room feeling suddenly too small, the air too thick. The bed seemed far away now, but she didn't move toward it. Instead, she reached for the notebook on the nightstand, her fingers trembling as she flipped it open to a blank page. Cash out early. The words appeared on the page as if they had been waiting for her, waiting for the moment when she could no longer ignore what had been said. The words felt cold, detached, but real. Too real. She stared at them for a long time, as if waiting for them to change, but they didn't. Cash out early. Could she? Could she really walk away from everything, everyone now? From the people she loved, from the life she had fought so hard to hold on to? Marilyn closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like the heaviness of the dark room around her. The laughter from the kitchen still echoed in her mind, their words taunting her from the edges of her thoughts. Her fingers clenched the pen, the small burst of anger rising within her. This wasn't the way it was supposed to go. They weren't supposed to decide for her. She glanced up at the door. Brian's voice had called to her, soft and concerned, but she couldn't answer him now. Not yet. The words from the kitchen, fading 6 months, clung to her like a shroud. Marilyn's gaze returned to the notebook, her breath shallow. She hadn't finished fighting. She hadn't finished living. Not yet. But the question lingered, heavy in the air, threatening to choke her. Could she change the ending? Marilyn sat at the corner table of the coffee shop, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, its warmth grounding her in a world that felt increasingly foreign. Joanne had already arrived, as punctual as ever, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Marilyn. She made her way over, her stride purposeful, her demeanor calm, though there was an urgency in her eyes that Marilyn could read without the need for words. Joanne slid into the seat across from Marilyn, her briefcase a sharp contrast against the cozy, rustic setting of the cafe. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Start moving everything now," Joanne said, her voice low but firm, as though this was the only option. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. Marilyn's stomach twisted. She nodded slowly, though a part of her recoiled at the idea. But she knew. In that moment, there was no turning back. They had already calculated her life. The plan was unfolding, one careful step at a time. Joanne didn't need to say more. She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder, then slid it across the table to Marilyn. It was thick, too thick for comfort. Marilyn stared at it for a beat, then opened it, her eyes skimming the contents. The first page was a printout of her bank accounts. Balances, statements, numbers that once felt distant now felt like a trap. The second page was a draft of her will. Her eyes skipped over the words. Some of them didn't even make sense to her anymore. "You'll need to move fast," Joanne continued, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Deb is your next step. She's a no-nonsense estate lawyer. I trust her. She'll help you restructure everything while Brian thinks you're just resting." Marilyn swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like a suffocating force. She had known something like this was coming, but hearing it laid out so clearly, like a checklist of her life, was almost too much to bear. "You're sure?" Marilyn asked, her voice small, tentative. Joanne nodded without a hint of doubt. "You have to act now. There's no time to waste." Marilyn didn't answer. Instead, she closed the folder and slipped it into her bag, her fingers lingering on the edge of the leather strap. Her hands were trembling, though she didn't know why. Fear? Betrayal? The weight of the decision ahead? The conversation shifted to more technical details, numbers, dates, instructions. Marilyn let it wash over her like white noise. It was all too much to process at once, but she knew she had to stay focused. Every move from this point on had to be calculated, methodical. The conversation ended with a promise. "I'll send you Deb's contact info. Call her as soon as you can." Joanne's gaze softened just a fraction, a flicker of something that Marilyn couldn't quite place. "You're not alone in this." Marilyn gave her a tight smile, but she didn't trust it. The truth was, she was alone in this, no matter how many people were involved. No matter how many carefully laid plans there were. Later, back in the quiet of her home, Marilyn opened her laptop. The cold light of the screen filled the room, casting harsh shadows on her face. She hadn't been back in the study in days, the desk now littered with stacks of papers she hadn't had the heart to deal with. But today, the urgency made her hands steady as she powered up the laptop and pulled up her account balances. The numbers felt like a countdown, each one ticking away the life she had left, as if the plan was already in motion. Her eyes skimmed the figures, the empty spaces in her accounts, the house deed tucked in the corner of the screen, almost mocking her. The will draft was there too, a document that felt like a death sentence now. She clicked on the file that held her house deed, studying the page like it was a foreign language she was only beginning to understand. The house, the one she had poured so many memories into, the one she thought would be her anchor, was already slipping through her fingers. Then, her phone buzzed. Carly. The text was short, just a simple question. "What's all this? Why are you packing?" Marilyn felt the air leave her lungs. She hadn't expected Carly to be so quick to notice. She had hoped, for a little longer, that she could keep up the charade of just resting, just slowing down. But Carly was sharp. Always had been. Marilyn could see her standing in the hallway, looking at the boxes of old photos she was packing. Images of a life she wasn't sure she wanted to let go of yet. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure how to respond. She couldn't tell Carly the truth, not yet. Not when the plan was still unfolding. So, she typed, trying to sound as casual as possible. Just lightening the load. The lie tasted bitter in her mouth, but it was the only answer she could give. She hit send before she could change her mind. A knock on the door broke the silence. Marilyn jumped, her heart skipping. Carly again? She hadn't been expecting a visit. The door was too far away for her to reach before the knock came again, this time harder, more insistent. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't face her now. Not yet. The next few moments passed in a blur. Marilyn rushed to shove the photos back into a box, but her movements were frantic, uncoordinated, the sense of time slipping through her fingers growing ever more urgent. Each moment felt like it might be the last before everything changed, before she could no longer control the outcome. Another knock. She froze. Could she keep hiding behind the mask? Could she really lie to everyone, including herself, for just a little longer? A sharp, insistent knock again. Carly wasn't going away. Marilyn sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the otherwise quiet space. The morning light was different today, harsher somehow, as if it could see through the thin veil of her carefully constructed routine. She hadn't seen Rachel yet, but she knew she was due to drop by any minute. Her fingers drummed anxiously on the ceramic mug in front of her, the warmth doing little to ease the tension in her chest. The door swung open with its usual creak. Rachel entered bright and casual, as if nothing had changed. "You still banking with Commonwealth?" Rachel asked, her voice light, almost too casual. Marilyn stiffened at the question, a tight smile pulling at her lips. "I might be switching," she said, trying to sound indifferent. She couldn't let Rachel see how much the question unsettled her. Not now. Not when everything was in motion. Rachel raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. She plopped down in the chair across from Marilyn, pulling a small notebook from her bag, flipping it open as if they were still discussing mundane things. But Marilyn's mind was elsewhere, running through the steps she had already taken. The trust account had been opened, the automatic payments reassigned, and the old account already closed. There was no going back now. Marilyn didn't need to ask Deb, her estate lawyer, any more questions. The foundation had been laid. The plan was in motion. Every detail was already mapped out. But Rachel's casual comment, her unknowing jab at Marilyn's most private affairs, sent a cold shiver through her spine. She had to be careful. Too much suspicion would unravel everything. She reached for her laptop, opening the trust account she'd set up. The interface was clean, sterile even, but the numbers on the screen felt like a quiet promise, something she could hold on to now, even if the rest of her world was falling apart. She clicked through, rerouting payments, ensuring nothing would go back to the old account. Every move was deliberate, calculated. The new account would be the foundation she could build on, and the old one, the one they had all relied on, was being erased. Rachel watched her for a moment, her gaze flicking from the laptop screen to Marilyn's face. But Marilyn didn't look up. She couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not until everything was locked down. Rachel sipped her coffee, her eyes still studying Marilyn. I'm not sure how long you can keep this up, she said, her tone light but with an edge of something sharper. Everyone's starting to notice you've been off. A little more than just resting. The words slid over Marilyn like a cold wave. Rachel was closer to the truth than she realized, but Marilyn didn't dare let that show. She kept her voice steady, her smile tight. "It's just a phase," she said, brushing it off. "I'll be fine." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press further. Marilyn exhaled slowly, relieved that the moment had passed. But the weight of Rachel's scrutiny lingered like a dark cloud in the back of her mind. Marilyn closed the laptop with a soft click, pushing it away from herself. She had already changed the passwords to everything: bank accounts, email, even the Wi-Fi. Everything was locked down now. No one could access what they shouldn't. Rachel finished her coffee and stood up, grabbing her bag. She lingered by the door for a moment, her gaze shifting back to Marilyn, a flicker of something strange in her eyes. "I'll see you later, but Marilyn..." Marilyn looked up, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "You sure there's nothing you're hiding?" Rachel asked, a casual tone hiding the sharpness beneath. Marilyn's breath hitched, her fingers clenched involuntarily around the mug. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, forcing the words out. Her voice was too steady, too rehearsed. She could feel Rachel's eyes on her, reading every minute shift in her expression. Rachel smiled then, a small knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. She turned and left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. The room felt cold, too empty now. Marilyn stood there for a moment, staring at the door. She knew Rachel wasn't convinced, but there was nothing she could do about it. She had already gone too far. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Brian. Rachel's text appeared before Marilyn could even open it. "I think she's hiding something." Marilyn froze. The words blurred before her eyes, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't supposed to know. No one was supposed to know. But somehow, Rachel had seen through it all. She had seen the cracks in Marilyn's carefully constructed mask. Her fingers hovered over the phone. She should text back, calm Rachel's suspicions, but the words wouldn't come. She felt paralyzed, trapped by her own web of secrets. What had Rachel seen? What did she know? Marilyn squeezed her eyes shut and put the phone down. The plan had been so meticulous, so foolproof. But now, with Rachel's suspicion hanging over her like a dark shadow, everything was at risk. She stood there for a moment, holding her breath, trying to quiet the chaos in her mind. But the silence that followed felt louder than any words could ever be. The walls seemed to close in around her, the pressure of what was coming too much to bear. Could she keep everything under control? Or was it already slipping away? Marilyn exhaled, her breath shaky, her hands trembling again. She needed to act, and fast. There was no time to waste, not anymore. Marilyn sat in the leasing office, the cool air of the senior condo complex settling around her. The space felt sterile, almost too clean, but it was peaceful. More than peaceful, this place felt like a refuge, a quiet place where the noise of the past few weeks, the undercurrent of betrayal and secrecy, could finally fade into silence. Her fingers brushed lightly over the top of the desk, as the woman behind the counter, Gail, she had introduced herself, smiled at Marilyn, a smile that seemed too calm, too sure. Marilyn wasn't sure how she had arrived here, how she had made the decision to leave the house, the life she had known. But here she was. The condo was small, quiet, and entirely hers. The lease had been set in motion weeks ago, and the documents now sat in front of her. The signature was a formality, but it felt like a pivotal moment in her life, like she was crossing a threshold she couldn't undo. The pen was smooth in her hand, its ink dark as it crossed the paper. She signed with steady strokes, not bothering to read the terms again. She had already signed her life away once. This time, it was easier. Easier to just let go of everything. The last chapter of her life was now a closed book, and this lease was the key to her future, or at least, the illusion of control she needed to believe she could find peace again. Gail slid the papers back to Marilyn, a reassuring smile playing on her lips. "You're all set," she said, her voice too bright, too final. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Marilyn nodded, taking the papers. The weight of them felt like a fresh start, but it was impossible to ignore the nagging feeling that she was running from something, maybe everything. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff from sitting for too long. The door opened with a quiet creak, and Marilyn stepped out into the quiet of the parking lot, her breath catching as she looked around. Everything felt new, and yet it wasn't enough. Later that afternoon, back at the house, Rachel breezed through the kitchen, humming a tune as she sorted through some papers. She had no idea how much the house, the life they had all built together, had already begun to slip through her fingers. Marilyn moved carefully around her as though she were a ghost, trying to avoid any unwanted attention. "Are we still on for the open house this weekend?" Rachel asked, glancing up from her papers. "Yeah," Marilyn replied, her voice a bit too flat. "I think it's a good time." She couldn't let Rachel see how tightly the walls were closing in around her. Rachel smiled, too brightly. "You know, soon we'll have room," she said with a laugh, not even realizing how much that stung. The words cut through Marilyn like a razor, too casual, too unaware of what had already happened. Marilyn paused, a tight smile forming on her lips as she nodded. "Yeah, plenty of room." Rachel didn't notice the stiffness in her posture or the strange edge to her voice. She was already lost in her thoughts, working through the logistics of the open house. But Marilyn couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel had crossed a line with that comment. She'd always been the one to make jokes, but this time it felt like a hollow attempt to cover up something that neither of them could talk about. Marilyn walked out of the room, the pressure in her chest building with each step. It was time to act, time to finally make her move. That evening, she sat at her desk, her laptop open in front of her, the cursor blinking expectantly. She had already arranged everything. The movers would come tomorrow, packing up her life in a matter of hours. She needed to be ready, to move quickly before anyone realized what she was doing. She clicked through the moving company's website, confirming the details, and then, just as quickly, started forwarding her mail to the new address. It was one small step, but it felt like another thread being cut. Another tie to the life she'd known slipping away. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Carly. The text was short and to the point. "What's going on? You packing up?" Marilyn stared at the message for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Carly would want to know everything, but Marilyn couldn't tell her just yet. Not when everything was still so uncertain. She had to keep her guard up, even with Carly, even though she knew Carly could be trusted. She took a breath and typed back, as casually as she could manage, just lightening the load. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but it was the best she could do for now. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. A soft knock on the door interrupted the silence. Marilyn's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening. She stood up, her legs stiff as she walked toward the door, her mind racing. She wasn't ready for this, not now. But when she opened the door, it was just Rachel, standing in the hallway, a cheerful smile on her face. "Hey, I found your antique mirror," Rachel said, holding up a piece of paper. "I know you love it, so I thought I'd put it aside for you." The gesture stung, a reminder of the life she had left behind. Marilyn nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, everything felt off balance. The mirror, the one Rachel had so lovingly chosen for their home, had already been scheduled for delivery to a women's shelter. Marilyn didn't say anything, just nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Thanks," she muttered. As Rachel turned to leave, Marilyn closed the door behind her and sank to the floor, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. There was no going back now. The decisions had already been made, and all she could do was face what came next. She was leaving. And nothing would ever be the same. The room was quiet, the air thick with the weight of finality. Marilyn sat across from Deb, her lawyer, whose pen moved steadily across the papers, the sound of ink scratching across the surface, almost deafening in the silence. The trust had been finalized. A permanent, irrevocable arrangement that would shield Marilyn from everything she'd once called home. The papers now felt like an anchor, something unshakable, something that could never be undone. The irrevocable nature of it was a relief. Deb's voice broke the silence. "This is airtight. There's no going back now." Marilyn nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup, a reflex. But the gesture felt like an anchor. "That's what I need," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "No more ties, no more obligations." Deb slid the final documents toward Marilyn, who scanned them quickly, her eyes flitting over the details. The power of attorney was officially revoked. Joanne was now in control, a fact that caused no small amount of discomfort. But at least it removed Brian from the equation entirely. No more decisions that weren't hers. No more whispered meetings or constant reminders that she was being watched. And with the health directives reassigned to Joanne, the last piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. "Everything is set," Deb continued, her voice smooth but carrying an undertone of concern. "But you've made some bold moves here, Marilyn. Carly's going to be a beneficiary, but only when she turns 25. Marilyn didn't flinch. The terms had been set long ago. She had her reasons. Carly would be safe, taken care of, but she needed to have some distance from the family until she could understand what that legacy truly meant. "What about the sentimental assets?" Deb asked, glancing at Marilyn for confirmation. "Are you sure about donating or relocating everything?" Marilyn's heart beat a little faster as she thought about the items that had once been so significant. The family heirlooms, the curio cabinet that had sat in the corner of the living room for decades, filled with relics from a life she no longer wanted. Everything, every last trinket, was either given away or sold off. The past had been emptied. No room for anything else. "Do it," Marilyn said, her voice cutting through the room like a command. "Just move it all. It doesn't belong to me anymore." Deb gave a small nod and adjusted her glasses before returning her attention to the paperwork. The changes had been made. The inheritance would be different than anyone had imagined. Everything was in place, sealed and ready to go. Later that afternoon, as Marilyn returned to the house, the silence pressed down on her like a weight. She had just finished with Deb, but there was still so much to do, so much that needed to be erased. She entered the living room to find Rachel standing in front of the empty space where the curio cabinet had once stood. Marilyn's breath caught in her throat as Rachel turned, her face a mix of confusion and suspicion. "What happened to the cabinet?" Rachel's voice was soft, hesitant, but Marilyn could see the questions behind her eyes. Marilyn stepped forward, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "It didn't belong here anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the tension running through her. The cabinet, once a fixture of their life, no longer had a place in her world. Rachel's gaze flicked to the now empty space, then back to Marilyn. There was no anger in her eyes, just something colder, something sharper. It was the look of someone realizing they were no longer in control, that they hadn't been in control for a long time. Marilyn didn't wait for a response. Instead, she turned and made her way down the hallway to the study. The papers had already been signed. The final version of the will was written, complete with a clause that made her stomach twist just to think about. Excluded for conduct unbecoming of kin. Rachel's name was now on that list. It was a quiet way to sever the last tie, the last bit of lingering obligation to the family she had once known. As she sat down at the desk, Marilyn took a deep breath and glanced at the door, wondering if Rachel would come looking for answers, or if she would just let the silence speak for itself. She had been the one to change everything, but now, as she held the pen that sealed the fate of everything she had ever known, she realized she was alone in a way that went far beyond the physical space. The emotional distance between her and the life she had walked away from seemed endless. A knock at the door startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. Her hand froze over the paper, the ink never touching the page. Could she really do this? Could she walk away from it all, knowing what was left behind? Her heart thudded in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect. But there was no going back now, no more second-guessing, no more what-ifs. Another knock, this time more insistent. Marilyn stood up, a flash of uncertainty rippling through her. As her fingers touched the doorknob, she knew that whatever happened next would change everything once more. The house felt colder now, quieter. The silence echoed down the hallway as Brian stood in the living room. His brow furrowed as he searched the space. He had been looking for her, his mother, Marilyn. The house was no longer her domain, but the traces of her life lingered, like shadows of a past neither he nor Rachel could fully grasp. "Where's my mother?" he asked, his voice tight. The words not quite fitting his mouth. Carly, standing in the doorway, didn't flinch. She had known this moment would come. The weight of it hung between them, yet she wasn't surprised. She didn't feel guilty. "She's gone," Carly said simply, the words falling from her lips without hesitation. New place. Brian stood still for a moment, letting the words settle in the room like dust. It was too easy, too clean. She was gone. Just like that. No dramatic exit, no last words. Rachel stepped into the living room, her expression a mix of confusion and anger. "She didn't even tell us," she said, her voice laced with something raw, something deep. "She just left, after everything we did for her." Brian glanced at Rachel, his expression unreadable. The old house, once filled with the sounds of family, now felt like a shell. They were standing in a room that had been emptied of everything but the ghosts of their past attempts to control Marilyn, to shape her into someone they could still hold on to. But she had slipped through their fingers, and now the space they had once shared felt hollow. Marilyn had made her decision, and there was no turning back. She had left behind nothing but a single note, a message that echoed in Brian and Rachel's minds like a final verdict. They found it, folded neatly on the kitchen counter, placed there with deliberate care. "Your bet expired." The words, cold and final, were like a slap in the face. The bet they had made over her life, over her decline, had finally run out. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the game they'd played with her existence. And now the game was over. Later that evening, as the finality of her departure settled into the quiet, Joanne raised a glass. The two of them stood on the balcony of Marilyn's new condo, a small private place that was hers and hers alone. The city spread out beneath them, the faint hum of life still pulsing beneath the night sky. "To a clean break," Joanne said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "No crumbs." Marilyn took the glass, feeling its cool surface against her fingers. The clink of the glasses sounded like the closing of a chapter, the end of a story she had never planned to tell. It was over. She was free. Joanne smiled, a look of approval in her eyes. "You did it." Marilyn nodded, the weight in her chest lifting with each passing moment. The world outside felt new, and for the first time in a long while, the horizon seemed full of possibility. She stepped to the edge of the balcony and looked out at the sprawling city below. The sun dipping below the skyline, casting the world in deep orange and purple hues. She wasn't sure what was next, but she knew this. She had control now. The life she had been forced into, the decisions that had been made for her, those were gone. Marilyn took a deep breath, her eyes trained on the horizon, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corner of her lips. The phone in her pocket buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. "Why are you doing this? Come back." Marilyn didn't answer. The number was blocked. She didn't need to say anything more. As the sunset cast its final rays across the sky, Marilyn allowed herself to finally breathe. It wasn't over, she knew that, but she had walked away, and no one could ever take that from her. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. The door behind her opened. Joanne stepped out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed. But Marilyn didn't need words now. The world was wide open, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The door to Deb's office swung open with a harshness that made the air in the room feel thinner. Brian stood in the doorway, his face twisted in frustration, eyes wild with a mix of anger and disbelief. He hadn't expected to find himself here, in the sterile, quiet office where everything had been finalized. Yet here he was, desperate for answers, for something, anything that would make sense of his mother's sudden disappearance, her abrupt exit from their lives. "I need answers," Brian demanded, stepping into the room without waiting for permission. His voice was strained, but the words had the weight of a challenge, a confrontation. "She can't just leave. She's not well." Deb, who had been organizing some files on her desk, didn't flinch. She looked up at him with calm professionalism, her gaze steady, unflinching. There was no room for uncertainty in this moment, and she knew exactly what he needed to hear. "She's of sound mind, Brian," Deb said flatly, her tone even, measured. "You're out. Permanently." This was her decision, and it was made with full awareness of the consequences. Brian's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if the words were foreign to him. He couldn't reconcile the image of his mother as the frail, fading woman they had all whispered about with the one Deb was describing. Marilyn had taken control. It was as if she had slipped out of the grip they'd all tried to hold her in. And that, more than anything, was the betrayal he couldn't face. "No, she couldn't have," he muttered under his breath, the weight of the words sinking in. "I'm her son. I have a right to know." Deb leaned back in her chair, her hands folded calmly in front of her. "You don't have a right to control her life, Brian. She made her choices long before you showed up here." She paused, letting the silence stretch between them, heavy with unspoken truths. "Your bet expired, just like the note said." Brian opened his mouth to argue, to protest, but Deb raised a hand, halting him before he could speak. "I suggest you come to terms with it. She's gone. The decision has been made. The trust is irrevocable." As the words sank into him, Brian's shoulders slumped, his fight draining from him. The air in the room felt colder now. He had been cast out of his mother's life, and he knew there was no going back. Later that day, as the evening stretched on, Rachel's email arrived. It was short, but the weight of it hung between the lines. She was trying to pull Marilyn back into the fold, to salvage the thread of family that had been left behind. The words were coated with guilt, a thinly veiled attempt to place responsibility on Marilyn for the rift that had widened between them. "We're still family," the email began. "We've been through everything together. You can't just throw it all away. Come back, Marilyn. We miss you." Marilyn stared at the screen for a long moment, the words taunting her with their hollow attempt at reconciliation. She had heard it all before, the manipulation, the guilt that had been thrust upon her like a heavy cloak. But this time, it wouldn't work. Not anymore. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and then typed her reply with cold precision. "Family doesn't place bets." The message sent, and the weight that had settled on her chest seemed to lift. If only slightly. She wasn't going back. She couldn't. Not to the house, not to the people who had treated her life like a game, like something to wager on. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Carly holding a small envelope. She handed it to Marilyn without saying a word, but the quiet gratitude in her eyes spoke volumes. Marilyn opened it carefully, the weight of the note inside simple but profound. A quiet thank you, the kind of message that didn't need to be spoken aloud, but was felt nonetheless. "Thank you for everything. You did the right thing." Marilyn smiled softly. Her heart warming for the first time in a long while. Carly understood. She was the only one who really understood. The days passed, and Marilyn slowly settled into the new rhythm of her life. The condo was everything she had hoped for. Quiet, peaceful, entirely hers. She had even joined a local writers' group, a small step that felt monumental. The group met every week in a small cafe, where people gathered not just to write, but to share their stories, their voices. Marilyn found herself at home there, with the gentle hum of conversation around her, and the sense that her voice could finally be heard. The memoir she had started to write began to take shape. Fragments of her past, her thoughts, her regrets, but also her triumphs. The words spilled out like a flood, a release of all the things she had kept hidden for so long. Each chapter brought her closer to the woman she was becoming, the woman who had finally walked away from the shadows of her past. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets below, Marilyn couldn't help but feel the pull of the past once again. The phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she stood by the window, looking out at the city. The world stretched before her like an open book. She wasn't sure where the story would go from here, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to turn the page. The petition was filed under a cloud of desperation, as if Brian thought that simply pushing harder would make the world bend to his will. He had it all, his mother's supposed frailty, his need to protect her, all wrapped up in an appeal to the court. He claimed Marilyn was being influenced, manipulated, and coerced into making decisions that were not in her best interest. The document was thick with accusations, but there was a hollowness to it, a lack of any real substance. It was a fight he wasn't prepared to win, and he knew it. But Brian was trying anyway. Deb had anticipated this. As always, she was ahead of him, her moves precise and calculated. The day the petition arrived in court, she was already ready. She had gathered everything, full mental health evaluations, Marilyn's financial history, every document necessary to prove that Marilyn's decisions were sound, and that she had made them willingly. There would be no loopholes, no cracks in the foundation of Marilyn's new life. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics, didn't even take 8 minutes to read through the petition before dismissing it. The decision was made before Brian could even catch his breath. "It's thrown out," Deb said over the phone, her voice calm but with a hint of satisfaction. The judge agrees. No grounds for it. Marilyn's free to make her own choices. Brian's protestations, muffled over the line, were nothing more than noise. The battle was over before it had really started. The finality of the decision weighed heavily on Marilyn as she listened to the voicemail later that afternoon, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. It was Brian's voice, strained with frustration as he left a message. His usual sense of entitlement had softened into something more vulnerable, more desperate. She didn't even bother to listen to the full message, the words already clear in her mind. Instead, she pressed end and quickly left her own. "Stop while you're behind," Marilyn's voice rang out clear and cold, her words sharp, almost detached. The message felt like a release, the final word in the long argument she'd had with them, one that would no longer go unanswered. She hadn't just walked away from the house, she had walked away from everything it represented, and now there was no going back. Later that week, the familiar hum of the city's routine seemed louder than ever, each passing moment reinforcing her sense of control. She walked into her small condo, the one that was hers, and settled into the peace of it. The silence, once oppressive, now felt like a companion, the soft murmur of life outside her window, a reminder that her decisions had carved out a place for her in a world that she had only begun to understand. But as the days wore on, the consequences of her departure reached beyond the legal battles, beyond Brian's protestations. Rachel's email arrived, terse and final. She had listed their house. The words hit Marilyn harder than she expected. She had known that Rachel and Brian's finances were crumbling, that the house was nothing but a sinking ship. But reading it in black and white, the debt that had caught up with them made her stomach churn. There was no sadness, no sympathy in her, just the blunt acknowledgement that she had walked away, not just from them, but from everything they had built. She wasn't sure if Rachel was aware of the weight that email carried, or if she even cared. But it didn't matter. Marilyn was done. She had made her peace with the loss of family. Whatever debt they owed, financial, emotional, was no longer hers to carry. The weekends were quieter now. Carly had started visiting, bringing books and a quiet presence that filled the empty spaces in Marilyn's new life. The books were always carefully chosen, the titles soft but meaningful, an unspoken gesture that spoke volumes. It wasn't the books that mattered, it was Carly, showing up with a sense of calm that Marilyn didn't realize she needed until it was already there. One Saturday afternoon, as Marilyn sat on the balcony with Carly, the two of them lost in a comfortable silence. A sense of something new began to take shape. It wasn't just peace. It was the understanding that despite all the things she had left behind, she had created something entirely her own. Looking out over the city, the sun dipping low on the horizon, Marilyn finally let herself acknowledge the truth. She had built something stronger than what she'd walked away from. The foundation she'd laid wasn't just legal or physical. It was emotional, personal. It was her. She had chosen her path, and now she was walking it, one step at a time. But just as the quiet settled in, the phone buzzed again. Marilyn glanced down at it, her fingers hesitating over the screen. The name that flashed on the display made her pause for a beat longer than she intended. Rachel. For a moment, she considered not answering, letting the call go to voicemail. But then, as the seconds ticked by, she picked up the phone. The past was never really behind her. It never truly let go. But as she pressed the phone to her ear, ready for whatever came next, she finally realized she was ready to face it. Whatever was on the other side of that call, she could handle it. The phone rang early that morning, shattering the quiet peace Marilyn had come to cherish in her new life. It was a call from a local reporter, a name Marilyn barely recognized, but whose voice held a familiar yet sharp, professional tone. Ms. Monroe, we're doing a feature on local philanthropists and those who've made a significant impact through charitable donations. We understand you've recently donated several pieces from your family's collection to various institutions around town, the reporter said, his voice a mix of curiosity and respect. We'd love to feature you in tomorrow's edition. Would you be willing to give us a quote for the article? Marilyn felt a brief flutter of hesitation. This wasn't her world anymore. She had distanced herself from everything that represented the past, including the items she'd given away. But then something stirred within her. A need to make one final statement, to reaffirm her departure from the life she'd once known. The pieces had all been symbols of what she had been, of what they had tried to make her be. Giving them away had been freeing. Why not say something that reflected that freedom? She agreed to the interview, and a few hours later, a photographer arrived to snap a few pictures of her standing outside the community center, the old antiques now housed in the display cases behind her. The photographer snapped away while Marilyn tried her best to smile, the weight of the camera feeling both familiar and distant at the same time. This wasn't the woman she used to be, and the camera could not capture the person she had become. Later, as the article was published, Marilyn's quote appeared in bold print beneath her photograph. People matter more than objects, and certainly more than money. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that resonated far beyond the pages. It was a line that would come back to haunt her. When Brian and Rachel saw the article, they weren't surprised, but they were furious. The local paper had put it in the public eye, and the small town they all lived in would talk about it for weeks. Everyone would know what had happened. Marilyn had walked away, and not just from them, but from the life she had once shared with them. Rachel's frustration was palpable. She was furious not just with Marilyn, but with the town, with the people who would see this and wonder what had really gone wrong. It was no longer just about the house or the money. It was about the whole narrative shifting in ways they couldn't control. The town now knew, and so did everyone they had ever known. The gamble they had taken with Marilyn's life, her legacy, had collapsed. They had lost, and everyone else knew it. But what really made Marilyn pause that evening was when Carly came to visit her. She sat on the couch, the same quiet presence she always brought into the room. But tonight, there was something different about her. Carly was holding a manuscript, a sheaf of papers with handwritten notes along the edges, and her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "What's this?" Marilyn asked softly, her voice a little hesitant. She hadn't seen Carly this emotional before. Carly opened the pages, slowly reading aloud from the draft of Marilyn's memoir. The words, raw and honest, spoke of pain, survival, and the decision to take back control. Marilyn had poured herself into the pages, her fears and hopes exposed for the first time, the story she had been too afraid to tell until now. Carly's voice caught as she read, and soon she was crying, the emotion too much to hold back. Marilyn didn't know what to say at first. She didn't know what to do with the tears that Carly shed. It wasn't just for the past. They weren't just tears for the woman who had suffered, but for the woman who had walked away, who had found her own path. Marilyn felt something shift within her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the people she had touched, the people who truly saw her. When Carly finally stopped reading, her face flushed with emotion, she looked up at Marilyn, her gaze filled with a quiet, heartfelt gratitude. "I don't know if I've ever truly understood you until now," she whispered. "But this is your truth, and it's beautiful." Marilyn took Carly's hand gently, squeezing it. "It's not just mine," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It's ours. I want you to be a part of it. I want you to be my literary executor." Carly blinked, stunned, as the weight of Marilyn's words settled in. She hadn't expected this, but it made sense. Marilyn was entrusting her not just with the memories of the past, but with the future, her future. Carly nodded, her tears falling freely now, a soft smile curving her lips. "Yes," Carly said, her voice breaking. "Of course I will." A few days later, Deb finalized the trust registrations. Everything was in place now. Marilyn had officially severed herself from her old life. Every move had been made, and nothing could change that. The trust was irrevocable, the foundation firm beneath her feet. Marilyn had crafted her own future, one that no one could take from her. As she sat by the window, the sun casting long shadows across the floor, Marilyn let herself exhale. The world outside had shifted, but in the stillness of her new life, she could finally hear the sound of her own voice, unfiltered, unburdened, and free. But just as the sense of peace settled in, the phone buzzed again, the name on the screen familiar. The call wasn't from Carly or even Deb. It was from the last person she expected. The past was never truly gone. Marilyn answered the phone, her heart racing. "Hello," she said, her voice steady but betraying the tension that ran through her. The voice on the other end was low, familiar, and filled with an unspoken threat. "Marilyn," Rachel's voice said softly, "this isn't over." Marilyn sat in the dim glow of her kitchen, the quiet hum of the city below her. It was a usual evening in the condo she had carefully chosen, a home that felt more hers with each passing day. But the soft peace she had cultivated didn't stop the quiet ripple of unease that surged when she scrolled past the local listings. There it was, the house, her house, a photo she could never unsee, a shot of the front yard framed by the bright banner at the top of the page. Motivated sellers. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She stared at the listing for a long time, the small image of the house frozen in place, and the weight of it made her heart heavy. She had expected it. Rachel and Brian had no choice but to sell. She knew it was coming, but somehow Seeing it there, out in the world, had the power to take her breath away. She clicked the link, letting the listing unfold. The photos inside were polished, pristine, everything arranged to seem perfect. But what caught her eye was the vase, the same one from the dining room, the one that had been part of her life for years. It sat there, in the middle of the living room, repurposed as a simple flower vase. Once, it had been an heirloom, something that carried more weight than anyone had cared to understand. But now, it was just another decoration for someone else's life. A quiet rage stirred inside her. She slipped into her shoes, pulling on the jacket that had become her armor over the last few weeks, and drove to the house. It was a short drive, but the journey felt like an eternity, each mile taking her closer to a past she had tried to forget, a past that had somehow made its way back into her life. The open house was bustling with potential buyers, strangers discussing the price, the neighborhood, the history of the home. Marilyn moved through the crowd unnoticed, an anonymous presence as she drifted from room to room. Her eye swept over everything, but it was the vase, once so central to her memories, that held her gaze. She stood in front of it for a moment, her fingers twitching at her side as if to reach out and claim it back, to hold it close one last time. But she didn't. Instead, she walked to the kitchen counter where the realtor was giving a brief overview of the property. Marilyn took a pen from her pocket and scribbled a note on a sticky pad she found beside the flyer. She stuck it to the counter, right next to the vase. "Some things don't belong here." It was a final statement, one she didn't expect anyone to understand, but one she needed to leave behind. She didn't wait for anyone to notice the message. She turned and left, feeling an odd sense of relief as she walked away from the place that once held everything she thought she wanted. Later that week, Carly visited, her presence as soothing as it always was. She brought a folder with her, something she hadn't shared with Marilyn before. "I have something for you," Carly said, her voice soft as she handed over the manila folder. Marilyn raised an eyebrow, but she opened it, and inside was a college art project. The title caught her eye. "What Family Isn't." The project wasn't finished, but it was clear from the pieces inside, paintings, sketches, and scribbled words, that Carly had poured herself into it. Each piece was a raw expression of confusion and pain, of what it meant to be part of a family that didn't know how to support or care for each other. Carly's perspective, though personal, felt like a mirror to Marilyn's own journey, a reflection of the same pain and search for truth. "This is beautiful," Marilyn whispered, looking up at Carly, who was now sitting beside her, watching her carefully. "But Carly, you've already found your voice." Carly smiled faintly, looking down at the pages. "I think you've always known it too. I just never knew how to express it until now. I was afraid of what I'd uncover." Marilyn didn't speak for a moment, the weight of her own history pressing down on her. Then gently, she put her hand on Carly's. "You're not alone anymore. I want to help you. I've set up a college account for you, under a pseudonym. I want to make sure you have the future you deserve." Carly's eyes widened and her breath caught. "You don't have to do that." "I do," Marilyn said, her voice firm. "You've always been part of my story. You matter." A few days passed, and Marilyn found herself sitting at her desk, looking at her phone. The screen blinked with a message. It was from Rachel. This time, there were no demands or threats, no attempts to guilt Marilyn back. Instead, Rachel had posted nostalgic photos on her social media, the kind of pictures that had once told a story of warmth. Family gatherings, the house filled with laughter, the happy moments they had once shared. But now, the comments didn't bite. The usual circle of friends, the ones who had always commented with easy praise, now fell silent. The likes were few, the comments empty. The nostalgia Rachel had hoped would draw people in, would make them remember the good times, now fell flat, like a tired echo of something no one cared to revisit. Marilyn couldn't help but feel a flicker of something. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was just the last shred of a life she'd walked away from. Whatever it was, it settled inside her quietly, unnoticed by anyone else. But Marilyn knew one thing for sure. They had sold something precious, something irreplaceable. And in the end, it wasn't just the house that had collapsed. It was everything they had built on false promises and expectations. The dignity they had once hoped to retain had been sold for nothing. As she sat in the silence of her new life, looking at the fading sunlight from the window, she finally realized that the past wasn't just a weight. It was the very thing she had been able to walk away from, and she wouldn't go back, not for anyone, not for anything. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Rachel. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon, tucked inside an envelope that felt too formal for comfort. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar, but it held no warmth, no real intention beyond a polite but empty gesture. It was Rachel. The dinner invitation was carefully worded, almost as if to disguise the desperation beneath it. We would love for you to join us this Saturday for an intimate dinner gathering. It's time we talk. Let's rebuild as family. Marilyn didn't even flinch when she read the words. She had anticipated this moment, the attempt at reconnection, the attempt to pull her back into their web. After all, the house was gone. The debt had caught up with them. And now Rachel's last resort was an invitation that reeked of guilt and the faintest hint of control. For a long moment, Marilyn held the letter in her hands. The silence in the room surrounding her like a thick fog. She felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just a quiet, detached emptiness. She picked up her pen and began to write a response. It was short, simple, yet firm. She had come this far, and there was no room for emotion now. No room for their games. My calendar is full. Indefinitely. She sealed the envelope without hesitation and left it on the counter. There was no need to explain. No need for more words. The decision had already been made. There was nothing left to salvage. The next day, Rachel's lawyer withdrew the claim. It had taken Marilyn no more than a week to turn the tide in her favor. Rachel's attempt to claim she was being manipulated had collapsed. There was nothing left for them to fight over, no new ground to cover. Marilyn had removed herself completely. Everything she had left behind was nothing but a shell now, and even the lawyer could see that. It was a quiet victory, and yet, it didn't feel like one. It felt like a door closing softly behind her, a reminder that no matter how much she had lost, she was always in control of what came next. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving in the silence, in the space she had carved out for herself. Joanne came over later that week. "We need a break," she said, her voice easy and casual, as if the weight of the previous days had been lifted from both of them. "Let's take a road trip. The coast's not far. We could use the air." Marilyn didn't need convincing. It had been months since she'd felt truly free, and now the thought of the open road was like a salve for the sting of everything that had happened. They packed light, just the essentials, as they headed out to the coast, leaving the city's noise and the memories behind. The drive was quiet at first, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The wind whipped through the car as they approached the coastline, and Marilyn found herself smiling at the vastness of the ocean. It felt like the world was bigger now, that there was so much more she could experience, away from everything she had once known. The trip was short, but it was exactly what she needed. The days spent by the water, the nights filled with laughter, and the kind of conversation that didn't come with strings attached, were a reminder that there was still joy to be found in simple things. For the first time in a long while, Marilyn felt truly at ease. Back home, she sat at her desk, taking a long breath before opening the document that had been with her for months, her will. She'd revised it again, shifting the remaining pieces of her life into a final, unshakable structure. This time, she made sure the final step was clear. She removed Brian and Rachel's names from the medical notification list. There was no going back now. That evening, Carly came by, her presence always a balm for Marilyn's soul. Carly had been a quiet fixture in Marilyn's life, but in the last few weeks, their bond had deepened, and it felt natural now. They sat together on the couch, sipping tea and talking about the past and the future. Carly pulled out a drawing from her bag, a simple portrait sketched in charcoal. Marilyn's heart skipped when she saw it. It was a portrait of her, sitting with a slight smile, eyes bright yet filled with something deeper, resilience. At the bottom of the sketch, Carly had written a phrase in her usual soft handwriting. The woman who cashed out first and won. Marilyn looked at the drawing for a long moment, taking in the detail of it, the way Carly had captured something she hadn't even known she had, the strength in her own surrender, the strength in choosing to walk away. "Carly," Marilyn whispered, her voice breaking with unexpected emotion. "I didn't know I could still feel this whole, but this is me, and it's more than I've ever had." Carly smiled softly, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You always had it. You just needed to see it." Marilyn reached over and gently pulled Carly into a hug, a simple act that spoke volumes. It wasn't just about the past or the future. It was about the present, the space they had built together out of everything Marilyn had fought for. As the sun set behind the horizon, casting a soft glow over the room, Marilyn realized that she had already won. She hadn't just walked away from the house or the people who had tried to control her. She had walked into her own life, and nothing could take that from her. But then, the phone buzzed again. Another message from Rachel. This time, the words weren't a plea. They were a warning. "I'm not done. Not yet." Marilyn smiled. Weeks had passed since Marilyn left, and the ripple effect of her departure still echoed through the town. Brian and Rachel, once the proud owners of the house, now found themselves renting a small condo. They had no choice. The grand family home, once their fortress of pride, had been sold. And now they were forced to live in a place that felt too small, too humble for people who had once flaunted their success. Even worse, the condo was rented from one of Marilyn's old friends, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Marilyn self-published the memoir independently. She hired a local editor, a friend who'd believed in her for years, and designed the cover herself. But it was Carly who breathed new life into the book. She illustrated the paperback edition, an image of a woman standing at the edge of an open road, looking forward, not back. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a reflection of the journey Marilyn had taken. The first few months were slow, as most independent books were, but word of mouth spread, slowly at first, then faster as more people began to read it. Local bookshops put it on their shelves. Small-town coffee shops displayed it in the window. Marilyn's face, unguarded and real, graced the back cover, her story printed in black and white for anyone who cared to listen. The book became more than just a story. It became a movement, even if it was just a small one. Readers reached out, some with messages of admiration, others with words of thanks. She didn't know them, but their words carried weight, especially the ones who said they had done the same as she had, left behind everything that didn't serve them. But not everyone was pleased with the exposure Marilyn's story was getting. A few months after the book's release, she received a letter, formal, stiff, and filled with a kind of legal jargon that made her smile. It was from Brian, or rather, his lawyer. The letter demanded that she cease and desist from selling her book, threatening legal action for defamation and damage to the family name. Marilyn didn't even bother reading it fully. Instead, she handed it over to her own lawyer, who assured her the book was legally protected. Brian's threats were empty, and he would get no satisfaction from trying to bury her story again. She had already won. The sales grew steadily, mostly through word of mouth and local support. Marilyn didn't care about bestsellers or fame. She cared about the truth, and the people who read her story and said, "You gave me permission to live my own." A few weeks later, Marilyn was invited to a local library for a Q&A event. It wasn't a grand affair, just a gathering of people who had read the book and wanted to talk to her. They wanted to ask questions, to understand her journey, to ask how she found the strength to walk away from everything. The night of the event, the library was buzzing with anticipation. It was a small crowd, about 20 people, but every single face was familiar, even if she didn't know them by name. She stood at the front of the room, the same calm confidence she had found in her new life settling over her. During the Q&A, Marilyn spoke candidly. "You can't always control what happens to you," she said, her voice steady, "but you can control how you respond. You can bet on yourself first. And if you can't trust anyone else, trust your own strength." The applause that followed was loud, but it was the whisper in the back row that stayed with Marilyn long after the evening ended. A woman stood up, her voice small but filled with gratitude as she approached Marilyn. "That book, it helped me leave my son's house," the woman said, her eyes glistening. "I was trapped there. I didn't know how to leave, but your story gave me the courage." Marilyn froze. She hadn't expected that. A woman, a stranger, finding herself in the pages of a story that had once been hers alone. But now it was hers and everyone else's who needed it. She smiled softly, the tears catching in her throat. "Thank you," Marilyn whispered, the weight of those two words carrying all the things she couldn't say out loud. In that moment, it didn't matter what anyone else thought. It didn't matter what Brian or Rachel had tried to do. Her story had already changed someone else's life. The night ended, and Marilyn stood at the back of the library, watching the last of the attendees leave. For the first time, she felt like the past was truly behind her, not just as a memory, but as a catalyst for something bigger, something that couldn't be rewritten. As the lights dimmed and the doors closed, she realized that her legacy had already begun to take shape. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden light over the small porch of Marilyn's condo. She sat there, tea in hand, her memoir resting beside her on the table. The world around her was peaceful. Birds chirped from the trees, and a quiet wind stirred the leaves, whispering its way through the air. It was a kind of silence Marilyn had come to treasure, a silence that carried the weight of everything she had left behind and everything she had gained. The condo was hers, the estate, the trust, the book, everything was locked away, sealed in a life that no one could touch. The past was gone, its hold finally broken. For the first time in years, she felt free. Her fingers brushed the cover of her memoir, now a tangible piece of her legacy. It was out there, her truth, shared with anyone willing to listen. And while the world outside was still loud with echoes of her past, she no longer had to play a part in it. The stage was hers alone now. Her phone buzzed on the table. Carly's name flashed on the screen, and a small smile tugged at Marilyn's lips as she picked up. "You still winning?" Carly's voice came through, light and teasing, but with an undercurrent of affection that always made Marilyn feel connected, even from miles away. Marilyn leaned back in her chair, gazing out at the soft, golden light outside. The breeze had picked up, rustling the pages of her book as though it wanted to turn them, to see what came next. "Every day," Marilyn replied, her voice steady. It was a simple answer, but it held everything, the peace, the strength, and the quiet pride that she had earned. A long silence stretched between them, the kind that only happened when words weren't necessary. Marilyn felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the air. The story was hers now, and no one could take that from her. Not Brian, not Rachel, no one. Outside, the birds' songs grew louder, more vibrant as the sun dipped lower, casting a soft orange glow across the porch. Marilyn closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the wind to touch her skin, carrying with it a promise of more, a promise that she had done it. She had fought for herself, for her dignity, and now the world could see the result. The final chapter of her memoir had come together not just as a story, but as her truth laid bare for the world to read. She had poured everything into it, the pain, the betrayal, the triumph. And in the end, it wasn't the money or the house that mattered. It was the dignity, the one thing that had been hers to keep. She had heard them bet on her death, on how long she would last, how much they could control, but she had won, not by playing their game, but by walking away from it entirely. The last line of her book echoed in her mind. I cashed out early, and they lost everything. The words were final, an ending she had never thought possible. But here she was, on her porch, at peace with the life she had chosen, a life no one could rewrite. Marilyn leaned back, her gaze drifting to the horizon as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. The wind carried the soft scent of pine and earth, and in that moment she realized something else. She had won more than just the battle for her life. She had found herself, whole, unbroken, and unapologetically free. The phone in her hand buzzed again, pulling her back to the present. It was a message from Carly. I'm proud of you, you know that? Marilyn didn't need to respond. The words, already written in her heart, said everything that needed to be said. She took a deep breath, looking out at the peaceful world around her. She had everything she needed, everything she had fought for, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was running from anything anymore. She was home. It wasn't just about the house. Word spread fast, and the town was buzzing with stories of the family's fall from grace. Brian and Rachel, who once seemed untouchable, now seemed desperate, scrambling to salvage what little dignity they had left. The collapse of their lives was on full display, their reputation fractured beyond repair. Marilyn, meanwhile, sat in the peace of her new life, watching from afar, no longer bound by the expectations they had placed on her. It was as if everything they had built had crumbled with her departure, and in the rubble, nothing was left but their own arrogance and mistakes. Marilyn didn't need to relish the collapse. She had already walked away from it all. She had found her peace in the distance. Later, quietly and without ceremony, Marilyn made another move. She bought a bench dedication at the local park, a small but significant gesture, a place for her to remember the distance she had created for herself. The plaque read, "In honor of peace that followed distance." It was simple, understated, but it was hers, a symbol of everything she had fought for and found, peace. The space she had carved out for herself, away from the chaos, was a victory in and of itself. A few days later, Carly came to Marilyn's condo, her eyes alight with excitement. She had been working on a project for a local teen author night, and tonight she would read part of Marilyn's memoir to an audience. It was a small event at the library, but for Carly, it was a chance to share the truth that Marilyn had penned. The story was not just Marilyn's, it was theirs now. Carly stood at the podium, reading aloud from the memoir. Marilyn sat quietly in the back row, watching Carly speak the words that had once been her silence. As Carly read, the room hung on every word. When she finished, the audience erupted in applause, not for the family's wealth or image, but for the raw truth of Marilyn's life. Marilyn didn't clap, didn't move. She sat still, her chest tight with emotion, but also with pride. Carly had found her own voice, and in doing so, Marilyn had found hers. She had stepped away from everything, her family, her old life, and now she was being heard. As the applause died down, Carly's eyes met Marilyn's in the back of the room. It was an unspoken connection, a moment where both women knew the full weight of what they had done and what they had gained. Marilyn had finally won. The day the letter arrived, Carly was sitting at the small kitchen table in Marilyn's condo, her fingers tracing the edges of a well-worn book. She had grown accustomed to the quiet here, to the space Marilyn had created for herself, and now, for the first time, it felt like home. The soft hum of the city outside and the faint aroma of coffee in the air were all part of a rhythm she had come to cherish. When the envelope came, it wasn't unexpected. The final pieces of Marilyn's life, her choices, her decisions, had already fallen into place. But as Carly tore open the letter, her breath caught in her throat. The letter was simple, elegant, typed neatly with no flourish, but carrying an undeniable weight. It was from Marilyn's lawyer, but the words inside were all her own. The handwriting, though not physically present, was in every line, in every carefully chosen phrase. Carly, by the time you read this, I will have long gone. This condo is yours now, but the transfer will be delayed until you turn 21. I wanted you to know that this choice was not made lightly. The house we once shared, the family, the way they treated me, it was never about love. It was a bet, an assumption that my life was theirs to control. I chose peace, Carly. I chose distance. And I chose you. I hope one day you'll understand, the way I know you will, that this was always meant to be yours. You were the only one who ever truly saw me. This place is yours now, to do with as you please. The foundation for your future, your art, your life, has already been laid in ways I couldn't do for myself. Carly, I trust you. I know you'll make the right call, just as I did. Marilyn Carly sat frozen, her eyes tracing over the words again and again. She had expected many things from Marilyn, but this clarity, this finality, was something else entirely. The letter was not just a transfer of property. It was a testament to everything Marilyn had chosen to leave behind and everything Carly had been allowed to inherit. The tears came slowly, silently at first. She pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the weight of it, but also filled with something else. A quiet, knowing peace. Marilyn had given her more than just a home. She had given her freedom, the kind Carly hadn't known she'd been craving. The freedom to shape her life, to live it as her own, and to break free from everything that had held her in place for so long. Through her tears, Carly smiled. She made the right call, she whispered to herself, the words barely audible. The reality of it settled in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. A bond that connected them beyond the legalities of the world Marilyn had left behind. The next day, Marilyn's remaining funds were donated to an art scholarship in Carly's name. It felt fitting, a perfect reflection of everything Marilyn had stood for: art, truth, and the power of making one's own choices. Carly wasn't just inheriting material things. She was inheriting something far more valuable. Her name would now be attached to something that would continue to give back, long after Marilyn's own story had concluded. Back at her desk, Marilyn's lawyer completed the final trust paperwork, sealing the documents with a sense of finality. There was nothing left. No property, no assets for Brian or Rachel. They were entirely excluded. Their names nowhere to be found in any of the documents. The bet had expired, and they had lost. The final papers arrived, and Marilyn's estate was settled, sealed, and filed away for good. It was over. Marilyn had never looked back. She had walked away with everything she needed. And now, Carly, her true heir, was ready to step into her own future. Marilyn had built her own path, and now Carly would walk it, with a legacy that was hers and hers alone. But as the papers settled into place, Carly sat in the quiet condo, her hands folded in her lap. The weight of it all, the trust, the inheritance, the love that had been passed on, felt both heavy and freeing. The world had changed for both of them. The phone buzzed on the table. Carly glanced down, her heart skipping a beat. It was a message from Rachel. The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. I want to talk. This isn't over. The decision to publish her memoir had been a long time coming. Marilyn had spent years in silence, watching her life unfold like a page she couldn't bear to read. But now, with everything settled, with the foundation of her new life intact, it felt like the only choice she had left. Cashed out, the family bet I beat. The title itself was a declaration. No more hiding, no more playing the role they had written for her. It was time to take ownership of her story, to reclaim everything they had tried to take. She didn't need a publisher or a platform. The internet was her ally, and she knew that her words would find the right audience. It was never about fame. It was about truth.